There are moments in life that seem ordinary while we are living them. Yet, years later, we discover they quietly directed the course of our lives. At the time, we rarely recognize them. I certainly didn't. I was about 10 years old. Long before the first bird announced the coming dawn, I opened my eyes. I had no alarm clock. I never needed one. Even as a child, I had discovered that if, before falling asleep, I told myself I needed to wake up before sunrise, somehow my mind obeyed. I slipped quietly out of bed so I wouldn't wake anyone. Outside, the air was cool and every blade of grass carried a drop of dew. Darkness was almost complete, broken only by the narrow beam of the flashlight on my hand. The world felt still, as though nature herself had paused a moment before beginning another day. The afternoon before, I had set a live trap near a neighbor's orchard. I could hardly wait to see what I would find. As I walked through the wet grass, I wasn't thinking about money, responsibility, or work. I was thinking about discovery. Children are always naturally curious, and some lose that curiosity. I was fortunate. Mine kept growing. And when I reached the trap, I stopped. Two bright eyes reflected the light. A large opossum stared directly at me, and for a few seconds, neither of us moved. His body was tense, mine was filled with excitement. Then he hissed. It wasn't anger, it was honesty, because he was frightened, and he made no attempt to hide it. Nature always impressed me that way. Nothing in nature pretends. A sick animal does not pretend to be healthy. A thirsty plant doesn't pretend it has enough water. A depleted soil doesn't pretend to be fertile. Only human beings spend energy pretending to be something they are not. Reality never does. At 10 years old, I couldn't have expressed those thoughts, but somehow I could already feel them. Many people assume I trapped wild animals because I enjoyed catching them, but the truth is quite different. Even as a boy, I respected possums. I knew they belonged there. Every creature has a purpose, whether we understand it or not. And the animals I was actually trying to catch were different. They were much smaller, yellow-bellied type of possums that were damaging my neighbor's papaya fruit in the trees. He owned around 12 acres of them, and he paid me 5 pesos for every one captured. For a young boy, back then, 1970, 5 pesos was good money. But if I am completely honest, money was never the reason I woke before sunrise. Curiosity was. There is a unique joy that comes from discovering something you didn't understand the day before. It has nothing to do with proving you're right. It has everything to do with realizing that the world is more fascinating than you imagined yesterday. That feeling became one of the great motivations of my life. Slowly, I opened the trap. The possum hesitated for only an instant before disappearing into the darkness, running as only possums run, slow and wobbly. I watched until I could no longer see him, and then I began walking home. Everything around me was exactly the same. The same trees, the pasture, the morning sky, the dew. Nothing had changed except me. Of course, I didn't understand that then. I thought I had learned something about trapping wild animals. Years later, I realized I had learned something far more valuable. That morning was one of the first moments in my life when I stopped looking merely at things and began trying to understand the relationships between them. Without realizing it, the observer had begun to emerge. Today, when I look back over my life, I don't think my journey has been shaped primarily by answers. It has been shaped by questions. I honestly don't remember when they started. I only remember that they never stopped. Why does one pasture grow differently than another besides it? Why does one cow thrive while another struggles under the same management, in the same pasture, in the same group? Why do two ranchers follow the same recommendation and obtain completely different results? Why? That little word has probably influenced my life more than any other. My father constantly became frustrated by my endless questions. Sometimes he answered them, sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he responded with a joke that as a child hurt more than he probably intended. For a while, I wondered whether asking too many questions was a weakness. Later, I discovered that it was exactly the opposite. Curiosity is not a weakness, it is the beginning of observation. Observation, however, requires something more. It requires the humility to accept that reality may not agree with what we already believe. That lesson will take me many years to fully understand. When my father didn't know the answer, I asked someone else. My neighbors, the parents of my friends, anyone who had lived long enough to have seen something that I hadn't. And when nobody could answer, I went outside. Nature never laughed at my questions. She never became impatient. She never said, "Stop asking, that's too many questions." She simply continued doing what she had always done, growing, changing, responding, leaving clues everywhere. Little by little, I discovered something that has guided my entire professional life. Reality has no ego. It never needs to win an argument. It simply waits until the results speak for themselves. My mother used to tell people that I was different, but not with a concern. She said it with a smile, a big smile. While other children couldn't wait to finish their homework so they could run outside and play, I wanted to play too, but first I wanted to understand how things worked. Why did one seed germinate and another fail? Why did one insect appear only at certain times of the year? Why did animals behave so differently from one another? And my mother, she never tried to silence that curiosity. She protected it. And looking back now, I think that may have been one of the greatest gifts she ever gave me. She was born in Madison, Wisconsin, in 1928. As a young woman, she did something that was almost unheard of in those days. She married my father and moved to Tampico, Mexico. My mother fell in love with Mexico. Years from that day forward, Mexico became her home. She lived there until she was 95 and a half years old. So sometimes I wonder how much of my own desire to explore came from watching her. She explored countries, she explored the whole of Mexico more than many Mexicans, and I explored questions. Neither of us was very comfortable standing still. Every evening, she would read to us in English, and she never hurried. She never treated books as something to finish. They were something to enjoy. Whenever I came across a word that I didn't understand, I interrupted. "What does that mean?" And she would answer. If she didn't know, we searched for the answer together in the dictionary. And that detail may seem insignificant, but it wasn't. She wasn't teaching me that parents always have the answers. Without realizing it, she was teaching me a way of living. She was teaching me that no one has to pretend they have all the answers. There is enormous freedom in saying, I don't know, let's find out. And I wish more education worked that way. Years later, people would ask me, where did you learn English? Some assumed it happened in a classroom, others imagined I had studied abroad. Neither was true. I was in our living room listening to my mother read stories. And today, when I think about those evenings, I realize she taught me much more than a language. She taught me that curiosity deserved encouragement, not embarrassment. It deserved conversation, time, and most of all, it deserved respect. Eventually, I began reading on my own anything I could find. The whole Encyclopedia Britannica, the Larousse Encyclopedia, books about nature, Aldo Leopold, agriculture, wildlife, science, history. I was not trying to become an expert. I was simply hungry for knowledge, to understand, to put the pieces together. My brothers never understood why I spent so many hours reading. My father sometimes wondered whether I was wasting my time. My mother simply smiled. She knew something that the rest of us didn't. She knew that every book was another journey. My body stayed home, my imagination didn't. Among all the magazines that arrived at our house, one became my favorite: Better Homes and Gardens. Most boys waited for comic books. I waited for gardening articles. I read about compost, vegetable gardens, trees, flowers, healthy soil. Then I walked outside to see if those ideas actually worked. Very early in life, I discovered something that has guided every investigation I've conducted since then. Books introduce possibilities. Reality decides which of these possibilities are true. And that distinction has become increasingly important to me over the years. Because knowledge is valuable, research is indispensable, science has transformed agriculture in remarkable ways. But every idea, no matter how elegant, must eventually face reality, because nature is the final reviewer of every theory. Nature is impossible to impress. She doesn't care how many degrees we have earned. She doesn't care how many papers have been published. She doesn't care how passionately we defend an idea. She simply responds. Every day, every season, every generation. The results are always there for anyone willing to observe them honestly. This realization slowly transformed the way I learned. I never wanted to collect information simply to know more. I wanted to understand how living systems actually function. Knowledge without observation becomes opinion. Observation without understanding remains incomplete. Real wisdom begins when we both learn to walk together. When both learn to walk together, sorry. Around that same time, I discovered something else about myself, that I enjoyed working. Not because someone forced me, because I genuinely enjoyed it. While some of my brothers searched for ways to avoid household chores, I often volunteered. I swept floors, mowed the lawn, washed, cleaned, bathed the dogs, picked up after them in the yard. But none of that felt like punishment. At the time, I didn't understand why. But years later, I did. The man I admired most worked with his hands. Everyone knew him as Sergeant Cucas. To me, he was much more than a gardener. He was an observer. So I watched him carefully. He never rushed. He never wasted movement. Whether he was sharpening a hoe, a machete, planting a tree, repairing a fence, or simply pulling weeds, every task received the same quiet attention. Nothing was beneath his dignity. Nothing deserved careless work. And children learn by watching long before they learn by listening. And without realizing it, I wasn't simply watching a man work. I was watching what respect looked like. Respect for the land, for the tools, for living things. Respect for doing ordinary work extraordinarily well. Many years later, I would discover that the greatest biological breakthroughs rarely begin with dramatic events. They begin when someone notices a detail that everyone else walked past. Observation isn't simply seeing, it's learning to recognize significance in what others consider ordinary. That lesson stayed with me long after I left childhood behind. When I think back on those years, it wasn't an easy childhood. I remember a fascinating one. Almost every day presented another mystery. A bird that I had never noticed before, a fish in a creek, a plant that I didn't know, a strange insect, a tool hanging in a workshop, a conversation between adults. Everything seemed connected to another question. At the time, I believed I was collecting facts. Now, I understand that something very different was happening. Nature was teaching my mind how to think. And that distinction has become one of the foundations of my life. Because facts matter, knowledge matters, education matters, but facts alone rarely change the way we see the world. Relationships do. Nature was quietly teaching me that nothing exists by itself. Everything belongs to something larger. Everything influences something else. And everything leaves consequences. So long before I ever heard the words systems thinking, I was already living inside one. As I grew older, I also discovered that nature wasn't my only teacher. People could teach me as well, but not all teachers teach in the same way. Some answer questions, others awaken better questions. And it took me years to understand the difference. One of those persons was my uncle Adalberto. He was the older and tallest of all the brothers, a quiet man, reserved. If you met him for only a few minutes, you might have concluded that he didn't have much to say. But nothing could have been further from the truth. He simply refused to waste words. When someone asked a superficial question, he gave a curt answer. But when someone asked a question because they genuinely wanted to understand, everything changed. His expression softened. His eyes brightened. The conversation slowed. Suddenly, it wasn't about exchanging information anymore. It became an exploration. And as a young man, I found that remarkable. Good questions seemed to unlock something inside him that casual conversation never did. Years later, I realized exactly the same thing had happened to me. Even today, after working with producers across many countries, I noticed that difference almost immediately. Some questions you seek confirmation, others seek understanding. These are entirely different conversations. The first protects what we already believe. The second has the courage to discover something new. Real learning always begins with the second. That's true. My uncle was also one of the first developing composite cattle breeds in Mexico. Among all the animals on his ranch, one has remained with me throughout my life. Tropicana is the breed, and the name of this bull was Goliath. I can still see him clearly. A magnificent red bull, short hair, sleek, powerful, calm, healthy. That struck me. Healthy. He carried himself with quiet confidence. He didn't need aggression to command respect. The first time I saw him, one thought immediately entered my mind. Someday, I want to produce cattle like that. For many years, I believed Goliath had been the lesson. Eventually, I realized he wasn't. The lesson was standing beneath his feet. While I admired those extraordinary cattle, I couldn't ignore something else. The land itself didn't seem to be improving. Every year, it demanded more care, more machinery, more labor, more investment, and yet the ranch seemed to respond with less. How could magnificent animals exist on land that appeared to be losing its vitality? I didn't have the answer, but I had already learned something much more important. Whenever reality contradicts our expectations, observe again. Don't argue, don't defend your opinion, don't invent explanations. Go back, look more carefully. Reality is trying to tell you something. And that single contradiction followed me for years. Eventually, it became one of the questions that shaped my entire professional life. When I entered the university, I felt as though I had arrived exactly where I belonged. Finally, I would study the subjects that had fascinated me since childhood. And I must say this honestly. Some of my professors were exceptional, especially those at the beginning and at the end of my career. Others simply taught curriculum. That happens in every university. Even so, every classroom offered another opportunity to learn, not only from what was taught, but from what wasn't. One afternoon, during a lecture on feed conversion efficiency in beef bulls, those trials they do, Professor Candelario Carrera was explaining how researchers carefully measure feed intake. The calculations were precise. Everything appeared scientifically sound. 1984. Yet something continued bothering me. I raised my hand. Professor, he looked toward me. If we are measuring the energy that goes into the animal, I paused. Why aren't we measuring the energy that comes out in the meat? There was silence. He looked at me intensely. What do you mean, Elizondo? Yes, a heavily marbled carcass doesn't contain the same amount of stored energy as a very lean carcass. If we're calculating conversion efficiency, shouldn't we measure both sides of the equation? For several seconds, no one spoke. Then he grinned, then he smiled. I have never forgotten what he said. Ah, Elizondo, you asked far too many questions. And the class laughed. Then he added, either you're going to be a genius or a complete failure. Everyone laughed again. So did I. But while the lecture continued, something stayed with me. I wasn't trying to challenge my professor. I wasn't trying to prove I knew more. I simply wanted the picture to make sense. Looking back today, I realize almost every important discovery I made began exactly the same way. Not with certainty, but with discomfort. With the feeling that two pieces of reality refused to fit together. And whenever that happened, I learned to trust the contradiction. Because contradiction often marks the edge of discovery. That afternoon, I walked out of the classroom with more than another lecture in my notebook. I walked out with another question. Over the years, I have learned that questions are like seeds. Some germinate within days, others remain dormant for years before the conditions are right. And that question remained with me for a very long time. In many ways, it never stopped growing. Little by little, I began to realize that what interested me most was not collecting facts. It was discovering how those facts were connected. I have never been fascinated by isolated pieces of information. I have been fascinated by relationships. Nature never works in separate departments. The soil doesn't know where soil science ends and plant physiology begins. Grasses do not distinguish between agronomy and animal nutrition. A cow has never heard of the disciplines of genetics, economics, microbiology, or grazing management. She simply lives within a biological system where everything influences everything else. So the more I observe nature, the more I realize that human beings often separate what reality had already united. We divide knowledge because it helps us study. Nature unites everything because that's how life actually functions. That realization changed the direction of my career, and I stopped asking which discipline has the answer and instead began asking what relationship have we overlooked. That small change transformed everything. People often ask where the ideas behind real world ranching came from. Some imagine they appeared during a research project, others may assume they were born while consulting ranches around the world, but the truth is much simpler. They began with thousands of observations that slowly connected with one another. While one observation by itself rarely changes a life, hundreds of honest observations eventually become understanding. The systems I teach today were never invented sitting behind a desk. They emerged while walking through pastures, watching cattle, digging into soil, looking at manure, listening to producers, making mistakes, of course, returning, observing again, again, and again. People sometimes imagine discovery as a dramatic moment, lightning, a brilliant idea, a sudden breakthrough. Most of my discoveries arrive very differently, quietly, one relationship at a time, almost without announcing themselves. And looking back, I don't think I discovered them. I think they slowly rebuild themselves because I finally learned how to pay attention. As the year passed, I had the privilege of working with ranchers in many countries, different languages, different climates, different races, breeds, cultures. Yet every journey quietly confirmed the same lesson. Nature speaks one language. The vocabulary changes, the accent changes, scenery changes, but the language never does. Healthy biological systems obey the same principles whether they exist in Texas, Mexico, New Zealand, Hungary, Australia, Argentina, or Austria. France, everywhere the same. That realization gave me enormous confidence. Not confidence in my knowledge, confidence in biology. Because if biology is true, it should remain true regardless of geography. Every ranch became another classroom. Every producer became another teacher. Every success taught me something. Every failure taught me even more. Many people ask me what is the greatest discovery of my life. They expect me to mention grazing, timing, body condition, nutrition, carbon in the soil, genetics, and while those discoveries have certainly influenced my work, they are not the greatest. The greatest discovery of my life is remarkably simple. Reality always tells the truth. Reality always tells the truth. It may not tell us immediately, it may require patience, careful observation, even humility, but eventually, reality always speaks. We can ignore it, we can argue with it, we can explain away disappointing results, we can blame the weather, markets, genetics, politics, employees, bad luck, but reality remains completely unmoved. She doesn't defend herself, she doesn't become offended, she doesn't try to convince you or anyone. She simply continues producing results. So over time, I stopped trying to convince nature that I was right. Sounds stupid, right? But that's what a lot of people do. So I stopped trying to convince nature that I was right. Instead, I began asking her why I was wrong. And that single decision changed my life. Because every time reality corrected me, I learned something I couldn't have learned any other way. I have made many mistakes, more than I can remember. I have lost animals, misinterpreted situations, believed explanations that later proved incomplete. And each mistake was painful. Some were expensive. A few were heartbreaking. But every one of them carried a lesson. Failure never became my enemy. Dishonesty did. Dishonesty did. As long as I was honest enough to admit what reality was showing me, failure remained one of my best teachers. The moment we become more committed to defending our ideas than discovering the truth, we stop observing. And when observation ends, learning quietly ends with it. That is why I have tried throughout my career never to become emotionally attached to my own theories. And I have said it publicly, if I find a better way, I will change. I will rather abandon an idea than ignore reality. Reality has earned that respect. She has corrected me too many times to do otherwise. Something else slowly became clear to me over the years. Not everyone observes the world in the same way. For a long time, I assumed they should, but I was wrong. Some people have extraordinary mechanical minds. They see engines, hydraulics, machines, electrical systems. Others naturally notice living systems, plants, animals' behavior, relationships, patterns, and neither gift is superior, both are essential. Leadership taught me that. When I managed ranches, I never asked the best mechanic to spend an entire day quietly observing cattle behavior. Nor did I expect the person with exceptional livestock instincts to become the happiest mechanic in the workshop. People flourish when they work close to their natural abilities. Nature has always understood that. Every organism has a role. Every species contributes differently. Healthy ecosystems don't depend upon sameness. They depend upon relationships. The strongest teams operate exactly the same way. The goal of leadership is not to make everyone alike. It is to recognize the unique contribution each person was created to make. And there was another realization that slowly emerged over the years. Real wealth ranching was never born from a single discovery. People ask me, what was your breakthrough? I thought, one afternoon, everything suddenly became clear. But life has never worked that way for me. Understanding arrived the way that daylight arrives, almost imperceptibly. A little more each day, one observation connected to another, one question leading to another, one contradiction that forced me to look more carefully, then another. Eventually, I realized that every important discovery in my career had followed exactly the same path. Observe, question, interpret, observe again, and never fall in love with the first explanation because it's bound to be wrong. That's true. Reality often has another layer waiting beneath the one we see first. That habit has probably influenced my work more than any technical knowledge I have ever acquired. Whenever I visit a ranch today, I rarely begin by asking what recommendations have already been made. Instead, I begin by observing. I watch the cattle before I ask about the ration or the way they graze. I look at the pasture before I read the forage analysis. I watch how people move through the ranch before discussing management, because every biological system tells a story long before anyone begins explaining it. I tell my workers, the cattle, the grass, everything is gossiping and telling me what you have done in the past month. If we learn to listen, much of the diagnosis has already begun. People sometimes think that observation is passive, but it isn't. Observation is very active. It demands patience, humility, discipline, and most importantly, it demands that we temporarily set aside what we believe we already know. That may be the hardest requirement of all. Because even though knowledge is valuable, experience is valuable, both can become obstacles if they prevent us from seeing what is actually happening. I've seen producers with decades of experience overlook something obvious because they had already decided what the answer had to be. And I've done exactly the same thing myself. Reality has corrected me more times than I can count. For that, I remain grateful. Every correction has made me a better observer. As my consulting work expanded, I began noticing something remarkable. Whether I was standing in Texas, Hungary, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, Mexico, or anywhere else, the conversations often sounded different, but the biological principles did not. Grass still depended upon sunlight. Roots still depended upon healthy soil. Microbes still carried out invisible work beneath our feet, even in Iceland. Cattle still expressed through their behavior whether the system around them was functioning properly. And nature was astonishingly consistent. Human explanations varied, nature, nature's explanations never varied. That realization gave me tremendous confidence. Not confidence that I had all the answers, confidence that reality could always be trusted. Whenever my ideas and reality disagreed, reality won. So eventually I stopped seeing that as a defeat. It became freedom. Because if reality is always honest, then I always know where to look for the next answer. Yep. Many years ago, I believed success meant accumulating knowledge. Today, I think differently. Success comes from improving our ability to observe. Knowledge answers yesterday's questions. Observation discovers tomorrow's. Then you stop reacting to what's happening and you can predict what will happen. Knowledge tells us what we already learned. Observation reveals what still remains hidden. Both of them are indispensable. Neither replace the other. Science and observation are not competitors. They are partners. Science allows us to explain. Observation tells us what still needs explaining. And when the two begin working together, extraordinary things become possible. And that has become the foundation of everything I teach. Not because I invented it, but because nature demonstrated it again and again and again. People occasionally ask me why I continue investigating after so many years, and the answer has never changed. Because I still feel exactly what I felt as a little boy standing in front of that possum before sunrise. Wonder. The excitement was never about proving myself right. It was about discovering something I hadn't seen before. And that feeling has never disappeared. I hope it never does, because the day curiosity dies, the observer begins to disappear. The day we become convinced that we already understand everything, we stop growing. Nature has a gentle way of correcting that attitude. She usually does it with results. Looking back today, I can still picture that little boy walking home through the dew. He had no idea he would someday write books. He had no idea he would travel around the world working with producers. He had no idea he would devote his life to understanding biological systems. He simply knew that he loved discovering how nature worked. Strangely enough, very little has changed. I still wake up each morning hoping to understand one more relationship that I failed to see yesterday. Perhaps that is what has remained constant throughout my life. Not certainty, curiosity. Not answers, observation. If I could leave you with only one thought from this observation, it would be this. The next time you walk across your ranch or farm, don't begin by searching for problems. Begin by searching for relationships. Watch before you measure. Listen before you explain. Observe before you conclude. Ask yourself, what is nature trying to show me that I have not yet learned to see? Because the quality of our decisions will never exceed the quality of our observations. Every healthy ranch begins with a healthy observation. Every biological discovery begins with an honest question. Every transformation begins the moment we stop trying to force reality to agree with us and instead allow reality to teach us. That was the true birth of the observer. It did not happen in a classroom, in the university. It did not happen after publishing a book. It did not happen while consulting in another country. It happened before sunrise, a flashlight in one hand, a question in the other. A little boy who refused to stop wondering. Everything that became real world ranching began there. And perhaps if these observations have awakened something inside you, the birth of another observer has already begun. If you want to continue this journey with me, it will be an honor to receive you in our Real World Ranching Academy.